Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Scott Noakes, and welcome to the mini lecture on the poetry of Catullus. One thing I think that students will find confusing about the poetry of Catullus is that the editors of our anthology have tried to organize the poems in such a way as to tell a story, particularly the story about his relationship with this woman who he calls Lesbia. Now, I think that can get very distracting, and we can lose sight of the individual poems that way. The reason the poems seem to be numbered out of order is because they don't actually come to us in an order that tells a particular story. That's something that our editors have created. So I'd like to, for our purposes in this class, just kind of ignore the story of the arc of the relationship of Catullus with Lesbia. We'll know what's there, and we can think about that a little bit, but I think it prevents us from looking at the individual poems. Now, one thing to notice about Catullus is the idea that Catullus is trying to base his poetry on an earlier, older style. For example, why is her name Lesbia? Lesbia is, we have no reason to think Lesbia is her real name. In fact, very often there are other people who, particularly a woman named Clodia, who are identified as potentially being Lesbia. But so where does the idea of Lesbia come from? I think sometimes modern readers will look at that and say, well, Lesbia is obviously a reference to lesbian, and perhaps it had to do with Clodia's her sexual activities. But in fact, in this case, Lesbia is not that kind of reference. Instead, Lesbia is a reference to a poet named Sappho. Sappho was from the Greek Isle of Lesbos, and everyone, man, woman, and child from the Isle of Lesbos is a lesbian. Sappho, by the way, also was a female homosexual, and for that reason, the word lesbian comes into our language as meaning not simply someone from the Isle of Lesbos, but also any female homosexual. Sappho happened to be both, and this is why we call lesbians, this is why we call homosexuals lesbians. Sappho lived about 500 years before Catullus, and I think we have the sense when we look back in time of thinking that, well, everything that happened a long time ago all kind of happened together. Like maybe those guys knew each other. But 500 years is a very, very long time, a very long bit of separation. And so I just want you to think about the distance in time between, say, you and someone else who maybe lived 500 years ago. In fact, to Catullus, Sappho would have been classic literature. Would have been classic literature from centuries earlier. And your anthology actually contains some poetry by Sappho of Lesbos. And I'd like to read to you very, very quickly just one, which is entitled, "Like the Very Gods in My Sight Is He." And this is by Sappho, not by Catullus. "Like the very gods in my sight is he who sits where he can look in your eyes, who listens close to you to hear the soft voice, its sweetness murmured in love and laughter, all for him. But it breaks my spirit. Underneath my breast, all the heart is shaken. Let me only glance where you are. The voice dies. I can say nothing. But my lips are stricken to silence. Underneath my skin, the tenuous flame suffuses. Nothing shows in front of my eyes. My ears are muted in thunder. And the sweat breaks running upon me. Fever shakes my body. Paler I turn than grass is. I can feel that I have been changed. I feel that death has come near me." And if that sounds similar to Catullus, there's a reason for that. Catullus is in many ways modeling his poetry on hers. Now we're going to come back to her a little bit later in this mini lecture. But for now, let's look at some of the poetry of Catullus itself. Let's look at poem 2, the one about the sparrow. We read this to you very quickly. "Sparrow, you darling pet of my beloved, which she caresses, presses to her finger, or teases with the tip of one sly finger until you peck at it in tiny outrage. For there are times when my desired, shining lady is moved to turn to you for comfort, to find, as I imagine, ease for ardor, solace, a little respite from her sorrow. If I could only play with you as she does, and be relieved of my tormenting passion." If when you're reading this you thought, that doesn't sound like a sparrow to me, you're not the only person to think that way. The sparrow is very obviously what we would consider a phallic symbol. Now what a phallic symbol is it's a symbol that represents male genitalia, represents the penis. And common phallic symbols are things like swords and spears, weapons, that kind of thing. Usually it's something that has, in the roughest sense, the shape of a phallus. But it can also be something that is simply something that is powerful or represents masculinity. So, for example, you might know someone who is a man who is very interested in his car. Even though the car is not shaped like a phallus, the power of that is supposed to represent to him his masculinity, which is why sometimes when someone has a car where maybe they have put spinners on it or a monster truck that they have tricked out, we sometimes say that they're overcompensating. What we're saying is that they are overcompensating for a perceived lack of masculinity of themselves. What's interesting here is we have this poem in which he describes himself and indeed his penis as a sparrow, not the most powerful of birds. And so from here, even in the beginning, we see that Catullus seems in many ways to feel like he is unmanned, like she is in control. He rather than being powerful, is little more than a pet to her, and she uses him for her comfort. And in fact, as he says, that if I could only play with you as she does and be relieved of my tormenting passion, he cannot even, in this sort of sublimated masturbatory fantasy, cannot even there find comfort because it's not her, because it's not lesbian. Now, the flip side of the phallic symbol is what we would call the Ionic symbol. And the Ionic symbol is a symbol of female sexuality. And common Ionic symbols often are things like flowers, the bud of a flower, which has a kind of visual image that reminds us of female sexuality. But also there are others, usually things that are associated in some way with fertility. For example, a field would be a common Ionic Ionic image that we might have, so that we are, in essence, the man is putting his seed into the field to grow. The earth is often a phallic symbol. There's a reason that we call it Mother Earth and not Father Earth. We consider the fertility of the earth to be essentially feminine. And by the way, this is also the difference between the phallic and the Ionic is one of the reasons that a rose is considered, long-stem red rose is considered romantic, because the long-stem red rose is both at the same time phallic in terms of its shape and Ionic in terms of its bud. But I want to show you again, curiously, what Catullus does with these phallic and Ionic images. And I want us to look at poem 11. Now, that starts out Aurelius and Furius. Now, I'd like to point out to you that in here we have Lesbia's body depicted not as a body but as the world, and that these men have been exploring the world. In other words, they have been exploring their body, or her body, and of course Catullus is jealous because these other two have also been in the same regions he has been in. When he says they're true comrades, this is a kind of bitter, sarcastic remark, because in essence they've both explored they've all explored Lesbia's body. But as we read this, I want you to look at the ways in which he represents her body, his Ionic symbol, as the earth. Aurelius and Furius, true comrades, whether Catullus penetrates to where in outermost India booms the eastern ocean's western thunder, whether he stops with the Arabs, the Harkini, Parthenian bowmen, or the nomadic Sagai, or goes to Egypt where the Nile so richly dyes, overflowing. Even if he should scale the lofty Alps, or summon to mind the mightiness of Caesar, viewing the Gallic Rhine, the dreadful Britons at the world's far end, you're both prepared to share in my adventures, and any others which the gods may send me. Back to my girl then carry this bitter message, these spare words. May she have joy and profit from her coxswain, go down embracing hundreds altogether, never with love, but without interruption, wringing their balls dry. Nor look to my affection as she used to, for she has left it broken, like a flower at the edge of a field after the plowshare brushes it, passing. Here we see a poem where we get the bitterness of Catullus really coming out, his anger, and he starts off with this image of her body that they're exploring, and the different parts of her body as mountains and rivers and this sorts of thing. And then it comes into this curse where he drops that image. He basically curses her, saying, may she have all this sex but never experience love with it. But I'd like you to note how this ends. It ends in a curious way. Nor look to my affection as she used to, for she has left it broken like a flower at the edge of a field after the plowshare brushes it, passing. Here we have the yonic image and the phallic image, but they've been reversed, again showing that he feels like he has lost his power in this relationship, because his affection is the flower. The flower represents him. The plow, which is normally an image of masculinity, of masculine fertility, is her. And she's broken his flower. She's left him broken. And if you go through the various poems, you'll see again and again and again Catullus using this yonic and phallic imagery and this sense that he feels like he's lost his power, he's lost his authority. Now, I want us to look at the prompt here for this week. Catullus often writes about how words fail or language fails. Point out an example of this in his poetry and discuss the implications. And in order to help you out with this, I want us to go back to that poem of Sappho, because Sappho's poem does this. And I'm going to look at the poem of Sappho, and we're going to examine the ways in which that poem has talks about the failure of language. Like the very gods in my sight is he, who sits where he can look in your eyes, who listens close to you to hear the soft voice, its sweetness murmur in love and laughter, all for him. So far, so good. But it breaks my spirit. Underneath my breast, all the heart is shaken. Let me only glance where you are. The voice dies. I can say nothing. This is an odd thing for a poet to say, the voice dies. Poets are all about voice. Poets are about what they can say. But my lips are stricken to silence. My lips fail. Underneath my skin, the tenuous flame suffuses. Nothing shows in front of my eyes. My ears are muted in thunder. I can't speak. I can't hear. And the sweat breaks upon me. Fever shakes my body. Paler than I turn than grasses. I feel that I've been changed. I feel that death has come near me. For a poet, the inability to express herself, the inability to hear what is being expressed, is like death itself. What I've just done here, I want you to look at the poetry of Catullus, and you'll find many places in which Catullus talks about how words have failed, how words aren't working. And I want you to look at some examples of that and explain how they work in the poem.